At Starbound, we tell stories the human way. Not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's I Am Duck. Let's begin. My name is Albert Jameson, and I am, or perhaps was, a writer by trade. I dealt in the philosophical, the speculative, the grand sweep of human progress as viewed from the comfortable distance of a leather armchair. I believed, as did most of my contemporaries, at the close of that remarkable 19th century, that we stood upon the pinnacle of creation. We were a people of empire, of science, of reason we held as unshakable. We had mapped the globe, harnessed the power of steam and lightning, and laid cables of thought beneath the deepest oceans. The world, we felt, was a puzzle box whose secrets were yielding, piece by piece, to our clever hands. We were insufferably arrogant, and we were about to learn a lesson in humility on a cosmic scale. It began on Horsell Common, a familiar stretch of heathland near my home in Woking. Gorse and bracken covered the common, a place of tranquil summer afternoons and the drone of bees. The strangeness arrived with a series of concussions, a whistling rush through the upper atmosphere that sent astronomers scrambling to their telescopes and brought curious townsfolk spilling out onto the sandy soil. The thing, as we first called it, was a vast metallic cylinder lying half buried in a crater of its own making, its surface dulled by the heat of its passage. For the first day, the cylinder became a spectacle. A sort of grim carnival took root around the pit. Men sold ginger beer and hot chestnuts. We speculated with abandon. Was it a meteor of unusual composition? A device of Russian or German make? Some new and secret weapon? I went myself, of course, notebook in hand, feeling a historian's thrill at witnessing a momentous, if inexplicable event. The cylinder was immense, 30 yards in diameter at least, and it gave off a faint, rhythmic humming that I felt in my teeth. The vibration suggested a coiled tension that pricked at the nape. The event's true nature revealed itself late in the afternoon. A faint grinding sound emanated from the cylinder, and a circular section at one end unscrewed. The crowd, which had pressed in close, fell back with a collective gasp. The metal cap, heavy as a battleship's turret, dropped with an earth-shaking thud. From the dark circular opening, something stirred. What emerged was a glistening brownish thing, the size of a bear, with oily, leathery skin and two enormous, dark eyes that were voids, yet reflected the afternoon sun with a terrible, luminous intensity. It had a V-shaped mouth, lipless and quivering, from which saliva dripped. Around this mouth, a cluster of 16 slender tentacles writhed and pulsed. We learned later this was the Martian himself, a being of intellect housed in a body evolved for a lighter world. A deputation had formed, a small knot of important-looking men carrying a white flag on a walking stick. They meant to communicate, to welcome, to assert the dominion of Queen Victoria over this strange new arrival. They edged forward toward the pit. As they did, a machine rose from the darkness within the cylinder. A polished, metallic box mounted on a tripod of jointed metal legs. From the front of this box, a device like a camera lens swiveled, aiming itself at the deputation. The machine responded with a flash of intense, blinding light and a wave of heat so powerful it felt like an open furnace door. A thin, shimmering beam lanced out, igniting the men it touched. The deputation's men vanished. They became figures of incandescence for a fraction of a second, then dissolved into puffs of smoke and flame. The silent lance of light swept in an arc. The common's dry gorse and heather exploded into a wall of fire. The pine trees on the ridge became torches, their needles vaporized in an instant. The heat ray, as we would come to call it, was a weapon beyond any we understood. A wave of animal terror hit the crowd, lifting us and throwing us back. We ran, we trampled each other, the air filled with the shriek of burning horses and the spreading fire's roar. I ran with them, my notebook forgotten, my philosophical detachment incinerated as completely as the poor souls who had carried the flag. I looked back once and saw the tripod machine wading through the flames it had created. Its metal limbs moved with an unsettling, three-legged gait, wading through the inferno it commanded relentlessly. The age of mankind, I realized, with a certainty that settled deep and cold inside me, was over. The Martians' age had begun. The British Army, in its infinite and disastrous wisdom, responded as it always had, with disciplined men, polished bayonets, and the resolute thunder of field artillery. A second cylinder had fallen near Woking, and the Cardigan Regiment focused its attack on this target. They were fine men, the Empire's pride, veterans of campaigns where courage and a steady rifle were the measure of victory. Against the Martians, they marched to their own annihilation. I am eternally grateful to have avoided witnessing this engagement directly. The accounts came later, pieced together from the babbling of terrified survivors and the grim evidence left on the scorched earth. The soldiers advanced in precise lines. The Martian fighting machine, a towering tripod that stood higher than the tallest church steeple, rose from its crater to meet them. It was a walking citadel of polished metal, striding over the landscape with a gait that was unnerving in its smoothness for a thing of its size. The army's artillery shells, the Woolwich Arsenal's pride, burst against its armored hide, leaving only blackened scorch marks on the polished metal. Afterward came the heat ray. The disciplined lines of infantry ceased to exist, erased in searing flashes of light. The artillery crews were next, their guns melting into slag around them. The heat ray performed a systematic, industrial-scale execution. Yet, in the midst of this slaughter, one man's actions bought us our future. He was a Royal Corps of Sappers signalman, a Corporal Pritchard, attached to the regiment to provide telegraphic communication. His station was a small wagon, a half-mile from the main engagement. His equipment, a simple Morse key and a hand-cranked generator. As the battle turned into a massacre, Pritchard remained at his post. He was a sapper. His job was to observe, measure, and communicate, and so he did. With the world ending around him, with the tripod's thudding steps shaking the teeth in his skull, Corporal Pritchard transmitted. His transmission was raw data. Tripod speed estimated 20 miles per hour. Stop legs approximately 70 feet. Stop heat ray effective range 900 yards. Plus stop depression angle limited by terrain stop. He tapped out the mathematics of our extinction. He was one calibrated instrument in the British military machine. And even as the tripod smashed that machine to pieces, he performed his function. The heat ray projector glowed for a moment before firing, a build-up of energy. He timed it. Firing cycle approximately 12 seconds. Stop visible energy build-up 3 seconds prior to discharge. Stop projector emits low hum stop. He tapped out the new war's language, a war of physics over courage. He was translating the Martians' monstrous power into numbers, into something we could understand, analyze, and perhaps, eventually, counter. A beam cut his transmission short. Rays traversing towards my position. The line went dead. The beam vaporized the wagon, the generator, and Corporal Pritchard. But his message had reached an exchange in Aldershot, before the wires melted. That single ragged strip of paper, pulled from a ticking machine by a terrified clerk, became the most important document in the history of human warfare. The message became the first seed of a functional resistance, a ghost's whisper of data. Its cost measured in a signalman's life. London fell. They dissected it. The tripods now numbering in the dozens as more cylinders arrived, engaged in a calculated violence of terrifying intelligence. They acted with the cold logic of engineers dismantling a complex piece of machinery. The great exodus caught me. The panicked, desperate flight of millions from the capital. The city, the world's heart, had a frantic, terminal pulse. The air was thick with smoke, and the Martian walkers thudding advance. In this churning vortex of humanity, I lost my wife. One moment she was beside me, gripping my hand on the crowded platform at Waterloo Station. The next, a surge in the crowd, a desperate push for a departing train, and she vanished into the mass of people. I screamed her name until my throat was raw, but the platform's roar of panic and steam devoured the sound. The train pulled out, its carriages crammed with a cargo of frantic humanity, and left me behind on the platform, alone. That personal agony became the lens through which I viewed the larger catastrophe. I wandered the emptying streets, a ghost in my own city, driven by a faint, desperate hope of finding her. During this period, in the silence between waves of panic, I understood the Martian strategy. A tripod waded across the Thames at Blackfriars. It ignored the grand edifice of St. Paul's Cathedral and the Tower of London. Instead, its heat ray melted through the railway bridge's main structural girders. Downstream, it did the same to the telegraph lines, melting the conduits that carried the Empire's nervous system. Another machine punctured the great gasometers at 9 Elms, one after another, releasing their contents in a spectacular but strategically significant plume of fire. They disabled London, cutting the tendons, severing the arteries, and leaving the great beast to bleed out. They understood that a modern nation was its infrastructure, the web of rails, wires, pipes, and roads that allowed it to function, to feed itself, to communicate, to resist. They were performing a phlebotomy on the nation, draining its lifeblood. Their war was with British systems, not its people. This observation, born of my aimless, grief-stricken wandering, became my purpose. I documented it. I was a writer, and this was a story I had to tell, even if its only audience was oblivion. I sketched maps in my notebook, marking the strike locations, telegraph exchanges, pumping stations, railway junctions, coal depots. A pattern emerged. The pattern revealed a campaign of industrial decapitation, and they were winning. My report, scribbled on loose pages and handed to a harried army captain in a makeshift command post in Hampstead, was a rambling, desperate thing. But it was clear-eyed and gained notice. The Martians revealed themselves as strategists, and to fight a strategist, you needed more than soldiers. You needed a different kind of mind altogether. They found that mind in a soot-stained town hall in Manchester. The city was a grim sanctuary, choked with the smoke of its own industry and the panicked influx of refugees from the south. Here, Britain's remaining leadership had gathered, grey-faced generals, grim-jawed politicians, and a First Sea Lord with a steady gaze who had seen his invisible navy rendered largely useless against a terrestrial foe. The men in the chamber slumped in their chairs, their faces grey with defeat. The Martians had broken the army and taken London, and they were advancing north at will. Into this chamber of defeat strode Captain Katerina Morozova, Royal Corps of Sappers. She was a tall, severe figure with dark hair pulled back in a tight, functional bun. She moved with a clipped stride, her boots clicking with authority on the marble floor. She was the daughter of a Russian industrialist who had fled the Tsar, and to her, the world was a series of interconnected systems above nations or people. She unrolled a map across the great oak table and pinned Corporal Pritchard's last message to the corner. Her voice, when she spoke, was crisp and flat, with the barest trace of a Slavic accent. "Gentlemen," she began, looking from face to face around the aghast military command, "your strategy has failed. You have treated this as a colonial punitive action. It is an engineering problem." She used a slide rule to indicate a position on the map. Corporal Pritchard's data is explicit. The heat ray has a maximum effective range and a predictable firing cycle. The tripods move at a consistent speed. They are machines. We must stop fighting the weapon and start fighting the machine. She argued for an alternative to direct assaults. Direct assaults were a senseless waste of men and material. Her plan was radical, almost heretical, proposing to cede territory, to retreat and draw the Martians out, to stretch their lines of support, if they even had any, and to fight a war of logistics, attrition, and industrial leverage. A portly general, his face purple with indignation, brought his fist down on the table, rattling the inkwells. "We have thrown the Emperor's finest regiments at them. Our best men have bled into the soil of Sari. What reinforcements do you imagine you can conjure, Captain?" "Who remains to fight?" Morozova fixed him with a cool, unblinking stare. She held her gaze on the map, at the intricate web of railway lines that covered the north of England like a steel net. "The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railways men," she said. "The boilermakers of Crewe. The chemists of Brannermond. The Rondas miners. Those are my reinforcements." She requested full command of the Northern Rail network and the authority to requisition any and all industrial assets she deemed necessary. Her demand was outrageous. The general sputtered, but the First Sea Lord, a man who understood the complex logistics of coaling a global fleet, saw the logic in her plan. He had watched the army's pride shatter, and he was pragmatic enough to know that a new approach was essential. He backed her. "That smoky room decided my fate. My reports on the Martian systematic targeting had made its way up the chain of command. It had corroborated Morozova's own theories. They summoned me, a gaunt, disheveled author amidst the uniformed elite. Captain Morozova looked at me. She assessed me as if I were a girder of questionable integrity. 'You are Jameson,' she stated as a fact. 'You see patterns. I am attaching you to my command. You will be my chronicler, and you will document what we do. For posterity, or for the next species that has to fight them, whichever comes first.' And so I traded my pen for a place in the machine's heart, a reluctant observer tasked with recording the story of how Britain would forge its salvation in the fire and grime of its foundries and factories. This chronicle, therefore, is a composite work. I've built it from my own eyewitness accounts, from my subsequent interviews with the principal figures like Mr. Bell, and from the terse but detailed field reports to which the captain granted me access. Where I was absent, I have reconstructed events from the words of those present. Our first journey was to the great railway works at Crewe, the nerve centre of the London and North Western Railway, a city unto itself. The works were a sprawling labyrinth of workshops, foundries, and marshalling yards, under a permanent pall of coal smoke and steam. This was the domain of Morgan Bell. The foreman, Morgan Bell, seemed cast from the same pig iron as the engines he commanded. He was broad and gruff, with hands permanently stained with grease and a face that looked as if someone had carved it from a block of Welsh coal. He moved through the cacophony of his world, the shriek of steel on the lathe, the rivet gun's percussive roar, the hiss of steam from 100 locomotives, like a conductor leading an orchestra. To him, Britain's railways were a living entity, a network of steel arteries. He had the timetables by heart, the gradient of every major line, the weight tolerances of every bridge between Crewe and Carlisle. He was skeptical of Captain Morozova, a woman, an officer, and a southerner with a foreign name. Her presence sparked his distrust. He stood with his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his cap pushed back on his head, and listened to a plan to move 2 massive 12-inch naval guns from the Portsmouth dockyards to prepared positions in the north. "Begging your pardon, Captain," Bell said, his voice a low rumble that still managed to cut through the work's din. "That can't be done. The GWR Trek gauge outside Birmingham will buckle under the carriage of stress you'll need for a weapon that size. Not any meaningful speed, the rails will spread. You'll have 50 tons of His Majesty's artillery in a ditch." Morozova accepted his point. She pulled a worn, leather-bound book of engineering tables from a satchel. She flipped through the pages, running a finger down a column of numbers. "You are correct about the Great Western Line, but you will bypass it. You will route the train through Worcester on the Midland Line. The track is heavier. The weak point will be the viaduct over the River Thames. It has a compression limit of 60 tons per axle. A standard Class B coal engine weighs 40 tons across 3 axles. The gun and its carriage are 52 tons on 2 axles. It is too much." Bell stared at her, and he loosened his crossed arms slightly. She was speaking his language, the language of iron, of weight, of stress. "So you'll use 2 locomotives," Morozova continued, closing the book. "A class, B in the front to pull, and heavy banking engine in the rear to push. You will place 3 empty flatbed cars between the gun carriage and each engine. This will distribute the total weight over a much greater length of the viaduct, ensuring the structure's integrity. You can make the crossing at a crawl of 3 miles per hour. The journey will take 19 hours instead of 12. It is achievable." Morgan Bell was silent for a long moment. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the grimy floor. He looked from Morozova to the half-assembled locomotive behind him, its guts open to the world. A slow grin spread across his face, a rare event that seemed to crack the coal dust mask. "Aye," he grunted. "That'll work." He was the master of the practical, the man who knew the steel and the steam, while she was the master of the theoretical, the woman who knew the numbers and the systems. Together, they tackled the immense task of turning Britain's railway network into a weapon. They moved men and supplies, shunting hospital trains onto sidings to let an artillery express roar past. Under Morozova's direction and Bell's execution, the railways became our arteries of resistance, pumping the industrial North's steel and fire towards the invasion's alien heart. The first true test of Morozova's strategy came in the brackish, tide-scoured waters of the Medway estuary. The plan was a lure, a trap laid with timetables, tidal charts, and the crackling reports of coastal wireless stations. From our command post, in a requisitioned manor, house overlooking the Kentish coast, we coordinated the operation. The bait was HMS Indomitable, an aging but still formidable battleship, ordered to steam up the estuary, as if making a desperate, foolish run for the besieged Chatham dockyard. The real weapons remained hidden, batteries of heavy coastal defense guns, their barrels camouflaged with netting and mud, dug into the marshy banks at locations Morozova had calculated from tide tables and survey maps. They marked ranges and orchestrated the battle with calculation before firing a single shot. I stood on the manor's balcony with Morozova, the sea air cold and damp against my face. Through a powerful naval telescope, the Indomitable moved majestically up the channel, a plume of black smoke trailing from her funnels. It felt like watching a condemned man walk the final mile. "They're taking the bait," a wireless operator called from inside the room. "Tripod spotted. Wading south from the Isle of Grain. Intercept course." A cold tightness formed in my stomach. Through the telescope I found it, a bronze colossus. Immense and dwarfing the battleship, moved through the shallow water as if it were dry land, its 3 legs kicking up plumes of spray. The battle began with a deafening roar as the Indomitable's forward turrets unleashed a salvo. 2 12-inch shells, each weighing nearly half a ton, screamed across the water. They struck the tripod's central body with tremendous force. For a drawn-out second I allowed myself to hope, but the explosions were just bright flashes against its alien armor. The machine seemed to shrug off the impacts. Its reply was swift and terrible. The heat ray lanced out, a silent, searing needle of light. It struck the battleship's forward turret, and the thick armored steel glowed cherry red, then white, then melted, slumping like hot wax. A secondary explosion erupted from within the ship as the ammunition below deck cooked off. The Indomitable listed heavily, wreathed in smoke and steam. "Fire," Morozova said into the speaking tube connected to the artillery commanders. The estuary banks erupted. From a dozen hidden positions, the coastal guns opened up in a synchronized, deafening chorus. Shells hammered the Martian machine, a relentless, percussive storm of high explosives. They concentrated a sustained, overwhelming force on a single point. The tripod staggered. Its armor, having shrugged off the battleship's direct hits, now endured a continuous, brutal pounding. The heat ray swept across the marshes, turning swaths of reeds into incandescent ash, but the dispersed and hidden guns overwhelmed the Martians' ability to target them. A near miss from a 9.2-inch shell detonated in the water right beside one of its legs. The underwater blast's concussive force was immense. The entire colossal machine visibly shuddered. It stumbled, a foot skidding on the muddy estuary floor, and for a terrifying second, it seemed it might topple. It recovered its footing, but it moved with a new hesitation, its strides shorter. And then it did the unexpected. It turned. It abandoned its attack on the dying battleship and retreated, moving back towards the deeper water, away from the relentless shelling. Its movements were clumsy, hurried. This was a flight. A ragged cheer went up in the command post. We had hurt it. We had forced it back. We had proven they were vulnerable. We could make them bleed, and we could make them run. Late as I was writing my official chronicle of the engagement, Morozova stood over my shoulder, pointing to a single line in an after-action report from an artillery spotter. The report contained the key detail, the observation that would change everything. Even near misses from heavy caliber shells caused the tripod to visibly shudder and struggle for footing. "Forget the armor, Jameson," she murmured almost to herself. "The shield is a misdirection. Their weakness is balance." While we learned to fight their machines, the Martians remade the world in their own image. Their second wave of attack was biological. A silent, insidious invasion began around each landing cylinder. They deployed the red weed. At first, the weed was a botanical curiosity, a crimson, almost blood-colored vegetation that spread at a visible pace, supplanting the familiar English flora. It grew in dense, tangled mats, covering the ground, climbing trees, and draping itself over the ruins of houses. But its most terrifying property was its affinity for water. It clogged rivers and streams, turning them into sluggish, crimson arteries. The Thames from Kew to Richmond became a silent, stagnant swamp of alien growth. I went out with a scouting party to observe it near the original Woking pit. The air there was heavy, humid, with a strange chemical sharpness. The weed rendered the world in shades of red and grey. The only sound was the soft, relentless rustle of the growing vegetation. The growth presented a vision of a new earth, an alien landscape. This was replacement, a form of terraforming so aggressive and swift it was horrifying to behold. This life form was a biohazard, altering the chemistry of the soil and water. It was digesting England. This new threat spurred a different kind of war, one fought with microscopes and beakers. Morozova, recognizing the existential threat, commissioned every chemist and biologist she could find, establishing makeshift laboratories in the basements of Manchester's university buildings. Morozova tasked them with understanding this alien life and finding a way to kill it. I spent weeks in those labs, documenting the frustrating work. The air was a sharp cocktail of acrid fumes from electrical experiments and the cloying, sweet smell of the captured weed samples, which quickly decayed unless kept in a specialized nutrient solution. The chemists worked, their faces pale under the gaslights, their lab coats stained with alien chlorophyll. They also tackled the black smoke problem, another of their terrible weapons. The black smoke was a heavy, inky vapor that rolled across the ground, suffocating all animal life it touched. Analysis showed it was a complex compound of elements new to our science, but its delivery method was simple diffusion. This led to the scientific war's first small victory, the creation of a functional, if crude, respirator. They were ugly things, masks made of treated leather and thick canvas, with a filter canister filled with charcoal and layers of chemically treated cloth. They allowed our scouts and work crews to operate on the verges of Martian-held territory, but they were a defensive measure. The breakthrough against the redweed came after a month of painstaking tests. A young chemist, a man named Walter Finch, was running a series of tests on the weed's reaction to common industrial effluents. He stared as he introduced a sample to the highly alkaline runoff from a nearby soap and gas works, and the weed disintegrated. The cells burst, dissolving into a grayish sludge. The key was alkalinity, the industrial waste. A caustic cocktail from soap and gas production was highly alkaline. The red weed, it turned out, had evolved in a planetary environment with a vastly different pH. In the presence of a strong base, its cellular integrity collapsed. The discovery sent a surge of hope through the labs. We had a weapon against their terraforming. The solution was crude: soap. The grimy, caustic effluent of our own industrial heartlands. We were going to fight their alien biology with the toxic runoff of our own civilization. Intelligence, gathered by daring scouts in their new charcoal filter masks, confirmed our fears and presented an opportunity. The Martians were using the original landing pit on Horsell Common, now a vast crater shrouded in a dense blanket of red weed, as a primary assembly yard where they assembled new tripods shipped in pieces from Mars. The pit was their factory, their beachhead, and their most critical vulnerability. A direct assault was suicidal. The concentration of Martian forces and the choking weed made it a fortress. But Morozova and Morgan Bell conceived of an industrial delivery. The old Besley spur, Bell growled, jabbing a grease-stained finger at a railway map spread across a trestle table in his crew office. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil and steam. It's a decommissioned line used to serve the rifle ranges. The army had ceased using it years ago, but the tracks remained. Overgrown, yet solid. It runs right to the less than half a mile from the pit. His plan was audacious. They would load a train with the deadliest products of Britain's chemical industry, tons of quicklime, caustic soda, and every other highly alkaline substance they could manufacture or requisition. They would send this train, a rolling chemical bomb, hurtling down the old spur and crash it directly into the Martian assembly pit. It's a one-way trip, Bell said, his expression grim. The trip is fatal for any driver. We'll have to get it up to speed and then jump for it. But a new problem arose. A young engineer in Bell's team, poring over old survey maps, found a critical flaw. The Brookwood Bridge. The spur crosses the canal there. It's an old timber and iron bridge, sir. Never rated it for this kind of weight. Particularly at speed. For a day, the flaw seemed to scuttle the plan. Time precluded building a new bridge, but Bell, a man who thought in steel, had a different idea. He looked at the map, then at the reports of Martian destruction in the south. There's a collapsed ironworks in Guildford, he said, a fierce light lit in his eyes. The Martians hit it last month. Oh, there'll be twisted girders, steel plate, scrap iron everywhere. We send a crew down there, cut what we need, and haul it back. We will reinforce the bridge. We'll build a brute force steel cage right under it. Just enough to hold it for 10 seconds it takes for the train to cross. They forged a solution from desperation and scrap. They needed volunteers for the train crew. Every man in the workshop stepped forward. Bell chose 3 of his best, and then announced he would be driving the engine himself. The men around him nodded. They had expected it. It's my plan, he said, and the men fell silent. My railway, my train. I'll see it home. I watched them prepare the crew special, as the men had nicknamed it. Crews loaded the flatbed cars with canvas sacks of white powder, tanker cars filled with foul-smelling liquids. The engine was a behemoth, a heavy freight locomotive chosen for its power and weight. It looked like what it was, a piece of industrial machinery, repurposed for a terrible and necessary task. These were railwaymen, going to war and doing the most dangerous job of their lives. The Crew Special's midnight run was a journey into the heart of the occupied territory. I chronicled it from the tense, crackling wireless reports of Bell's own account, delivered afterwards in his characteristic understated manner. They travelled with their lights extinguished, a phantom train sliding through a dead landscape. The territory south of Reading was Martian country now. The Martian weed had erased the familiar English countryside, replaced by the red weed's eerie crimson glow and the skeletal silhouettes of burned-out farms. The constant threat was the hum of a tripod patrol, the sweep of a heat ray over a distant ridge. They reached the damaged Brookwood Bridge hours before dawn. In the pre-dawn darkness, Bell's reinforcement crew had done their work. They had wrestled salvaged girders from the Guildford ruins into place, creating a crude but immensely strong cradle of steel beneath the old timber trestles. The cradle was an ugly, brutally functional monument to industrial improvisation. Bell eased the heavy train onto the bridge The timbers groaned in protest, the sound loud in the unnatural stillness. The entire structure sagged, but the scrap iron cage held firm. They crossed at a crawl, the mission's fate resting on a few tons of scavenged steel. They cleared the bridge and the men let out a collective, shuddering breath of relief. The final stretch was a straight, gentle downgrade towards the common. This was it. Bell opened the throttle wide. The firemen shoveled coal with a desperate, rhythmic fury, pushing the steam pressure well past its safety limits. The locomotive, unburdened by any need for preservation, surged forward, its pistons pounding with a frantic, powerful rhythm. The train gathered speed, roaring through the darkness at a suicidal pace. Through the locomotive's front window, a hellish, crimson glow pulsed from beyond the trees. The Martian pit. "No!" Bell roared over the engine's shriek. With the train hurtling at over 80 miles an hour and the end of the line rushing towards them, he and his crew jumped, leaping from the speeding locomotive into the thorny embrace of a gorse thicket. They hit the ground hard, bruised and battered, and scrambled for cover. The crew special, riderless and committed to its path, screamed on. It hit the line's end, ripped through the buffers, and plowed a massive furrow through the earth. It soared into the air for a moment before crashing nose down into the Martian crater's center. The impact was cataclysmic. The tanker cars ruptured, spraying their caustic contents over everything. The sacks of quicklime burst, blanketing the area in a choking white dust. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The water that the redweed craved became the catalyst for a massive chemical fire. Quicklime and water create intense heat, and the caustic soda dissolved everything it touched. A horrifying, searing roar erupted as a chemical inferno consumed the pit. A pillar of white, corrosive steam erupted, carrying with it a sound that was organic, a high-pitched, ululating shriek of alien pain. Through the steam, Bell and his men witnessed Martian machines melting, their metal skins dissolving like salt in water. They witnessed the red weed blacken and wither, collapsing into a foul-smelling sludge. They had scoured the factory from the face of the planet with a tidal wave of industrial poison, turning the Martians' own terraformed environment into a chemical trap. The act was a victory of profound and terrible ingenuity. For a week, a strange and deceptive quiet fell over the front. We had hurt them, badly, and they had withdrawn to consider their wounds. The quiet was a deceptive hope. We had shown them our true weapons, and they were taking the time to understand them before responding in kind. The Martian response came swiftly, and when it did, their response was proof of their chilling intelligence. The Martians adapted, learning their lesson. Having broken our armies and sunk our navy, they recognized the attack on the Woking pit was different. The attack on the Woking pit was an assault on their biology and industry, delivered by a system they had previously ignored. They adapted. Their entire strategy shifted with stunning speed. The advance northward slowed to a halt. The terror strikes on towns and villages ceased. A new, far more terrifying pattern of destruction emerged, one following Captain Morozova's own logic with horrifying accuracy. A wireless report came in from Sheffield. A tripod had destroyed the country's 3 largest steelworks, targeting only the foundries and leaving the city itself standing. They leveled the Bessemer converters, melted the rolling mills, and collapsed the smokestacks. Another report from South Wales. The Martians targeted the Rhondda Valley's coal pits, the source of high-grade steam coal that powered our railways and factories. They used their heat rays to collapse the pit heads, sealing the mines and trapping hundreds of men below ground. They were killing our capacity to make steam. Next they came for the chemical plants in Cheshire, the factories that had produced the alkaline compounds for the crew special. They pulverized them. The message was brutally clear. You have shown us your weapons. Now we will take them from you. They became industrial saboteurs in addition to conquerors. They were waging a total war on our ability to resist, striking at the source of our strength. Each devastating attack was a reply in a language we now understood completely. The brief elation we felt after the Woking victory evaporated, replaced by a profound dread. We had shown them our heart, and now they were coming to cut it. The pressure was immense, the work relentless. We were always moving, setting up new command posts in commandeered schools and abandoned factories, staying one step ahead of the Martians' new strategy. The days became a continuous blur of maps, casualty reports, and the constant desperate effort to keep the trains running. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in chairs or on floors. One evening during a forced halt while a Martian patrol swept through the valley below, I found myself sharing a railway maintenance shed with Morgan Bell. The air was cold and smelled of diesel and rust. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. Through a crack in the wooden wall, we could see the distant, gliding silhouette of a tripod, its single red eye scanning the landscape. I was there to interview Bell, to get his crew's special's official account for the Chronicle, but the formalities seemed absurd in that moment. We were two exhausted men, hiding in the dark. I offered him my thermos, which contained a weak, lukewarm tea. He took it with a grateful nod, his grease-blackened hands wrapping around the small cup. He was quiet for several minutes, sipping the tea and watching the distant machine. The foreman, stripped of the noise and fury of his workshop, seemed a different man, older, wearier. "My Lily," he said, his voice soft. "My daughter, she's 9. Her aunt in Colne has her. I sent her a postcard last week, drew a picture of a locomotive on it. She likes engines." He stared into his cup. All this running about, all this noise. At the end of it, all I can think about is whether she's warm, whether she's frightened. I just want to sit with her in the garden again and listen to the 6 o'clock express go by. You could set your watch by that train. He fell silent, leaving his words to hang in the cold air. The pride in a well-run timetable, the simple, profound hope of seeing his daughter again. He fought for something more immediate than empire, or king, or country. He fought for the 6 o'clock express. He fought for his Lily's garden. I told him about my wife, about the chaos at Waterloo, about the uncertainty that was a constant, dull ache in my chest. He listened, nodding thoughtfully. In that cold, greasy shed beyond our titles of writer and foreman, we were two men who had lost the ordinary, precious things that made up a life. For me, the chronicler of grand strategies and technological battles, the conversation was a clarifying moment. I documented the war of machines, of systems, of chemicals and steel, but Morgan Bell, with his simple, heartfelt words, reminded me of the true stakes. Our fight was for the right to a life that was wonderfully boring and predictable, for timetables and tea and sitting in a garden with the people we loved. That was the pride. That was everything. The breakthrough, like all the crucial turns in this war, came from an observation. A single detail obsessed Captain Morozova, the way the tripods moved. She spent days poring over reconnaissance sketches and my own written accounts, particularly the detailed report from the Medway battle. She fixated on the line about the tripod shuddering from the underwater explosion, how it had struggled for balance. We were in a new headquarters, a cavernous, disused textile mill in the Peak District. The frantic ticking of telegraphs had replaced the clatter of looms. Technicians had set up a telescope on the roof, aimed at a distant, damaged tripod that had become immobilized on a hillside after a skirmish. It was stationary yet intact, occasionally shifting its weight. Morozova watched it for hours, unmoving, a hawk studying its prey. I stood beside her, shivering in the high-altitude wind. "Jameson," she murmured, "look at the legs, the feet, not the machine." I put my eye to the telescope. The tripod was making constant, minute adjustments. A piston would fire here, a joint would shift a fraction of an inch there. The adjustments were a continuous dance of subtle, complex mechanisms. "ET's not standing," Morozova whispered, her eyes alight with a terrifying intensity. "ET's balancing, actively, every second." An electrical engineer, a quiet man named Howell, who was instrumental in keeping our wireless network running, had come up to deliver a report. He glanced through the telescope himself. "Remarkable actuators," he commented, more to himself than to us. "Must be a devilishly complex system to keep a thing that tall stable. Reminds me of some of Mr. Tesla's experiments with resonant frequencies. He claimed that with the right frequency, he could shake a building to pieces. A sort of mechanical sympathy." Morozova went still. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, but she ignored it. She fixed her eyes on the distant tripod, but her mind was clearly somewhere else entirely, seeing something new. The engineer's offhand remark was the key that unlocked the puzzle. She turned to me, her face pale but luminous with discovery. "Jameson," she said, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "That's it. That's the key." She grabbed my arm, her grip strong. "We've been trying to punch through the armor. We're thinking like soldiers." She tapped her own temple. "We need to think like engineers. Liquefy the foundations and the wall collapses on its own." She looked back at the tripod, a predator smile touching her lips. "Forget the armor. Our goal is to make it stumble." The war's greatest gamble followed. Morozova's plan was of such audacious scale and risk that it seemed more like a fantasy than a viable military strategy. Morozova proposed a great feigned retreat, a deliberate abandonment of the industrial heartlands of Manchester and Liverpool. She would order the British Army to conduct a chaotic, seemingly desperate fighting withdrawal, giving up the cities we had bled to defend. The withdrawal was a monumental piece of theatre, designed to do one thing: lure the main Martian column, their entire northern assault force, into a single decisive trap. The trap was a long, narrow valley in the Peak District, a place called Longdendale. On a map, the valley was an unremarkable feature of the landscape, but to Morozova and Morgan Bell, it was the perfect killing ground, a deep valley with steep, unforgiving ridges on both sides, limiting the Martians' lines of sight and movement, and crucially, heavy-duty rail lines, hidden from the Martians, crisscrossed it, spurs built to serve the quarries and reservoirs in the area. Morozova gave the order, and the retreat began. The retreat was a masterpiece of orchestrated chaos. To the Martians, it must have looked like the final collapse of human resistance. They took the bait, seeing our armies breaking and our cities abandoned, and sensing victory was within their grasp. Their entire column, more than 30 tripods, altered course, pursuing our fleet forces directly into the mouth of Longdendale Valley. As they advanced, an operation of incredible speed and stealth unfolded. For 3 frantic weeks, under the constant terror of Martian patrols, Bell's crews performed a feat of logistics. This was Morgan Bell's symphony, using the hidden rail lines, His crew worked with a feverish, silent intensity. They moved dozens of our heaviest guns, 13.5-inch coastal defense cannons, naval guns stripped from damaged ships, siege howitzers, into camouflaged positions carved into the valley's ridges. Each gun weighed over 60 tons. Moving one was a Herculean task. Moving scores of them in a matter of days was a triumph of logistics and sheer, stubborn will. Simultaneously, another army of engineers led by the quiet Mr. Howell was laying miles of heavy-gauge copper cable throughout the valley floor. The cable served a different purpose from communication, connecting to massive induction coils stripped from power stations and powered by dynamos hauled out of the textile mills we had just abandoned. They turned the entire valley into a massive low-frequency electromagnetic generator. The device was Nikola Tesla's theory, weaponized on a terrifying scale. This was the Thunder Line. I watched them work, a chronicler overwhelmed by the sheer, grimy magnificence of it all. Men covered in mud and grease, strained against massive levers to inch a gun into place. Others, their faces illuminated by sparks from a welding torch, connected the thick cables. The effort was the culmination of everything we had learnt. This was a battle of railwaymen, miners, and engineers, the industrial age's final, defiant roar. On the battle's eve, in a cavernous railway shed hidden in a side valley, Morozova briefed the assembled artillery commanders. They comprised career army officers and hastily commissioned industrial managers, their faces grim in the flickering lantern light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and engine oil. Morozova stood before a huge, hand-drawn Longdendale Valley map, the gun positions marked in red, the copper cable layout in blue. Her voice held the certainty of her calculations. Gentlemen, her voice echoed in the vast space. Tomorrow, the main Martian force will enter this valley. They will believe they are pursuing a broken enemy. They will be wrong. She used a long wooden pointer to trace the blue line's path. These cables, powered by the dynamos from the Manchester mills, will generate a powerful, irregularly fluctuating electromagnetic field across the entire valley floor. This weapon is subtler than a death ray. Its harm is indirect. Its purpose is to interfere. She paused, letting her words sink in. As our observations have confirmed, the Martian tripods maintain their stability through a system of constant, minute, high-speed adjustments. We theorize that sophisticated electrical actuators in their joints control this system. The field we generate will interfere with those actuators. It will disrupt their signals, introduce a flicker, a hesitation in their balancing process. A grizzled artillery colonel, a man who had seen his entire battery annihilated at the war's start, looked skeptical. "Oh, you mean to say, Captain, we're going to try and trip them up?" "Exactly, Colonel," Morozova replied with utter sincerity. "At their height, with their high center of gravity, even a momentary loss of balance is catastrophic. We are creating an environment where their own design becomes their greatest weakness. It is an unproven theory and a monumental gamble, our only chance for survival." She then turned to the gun positions marked in red. "You will hold your fire until my signal. Target their legs exclusively. Your goal is to cripple their mobility. Penetrating armor is a secondary concern. When they stumble, you will fire. All of you, at once. We will break their legs, and then we will break them." The briefing ended. The men filed out into the night, their faces a mixture of fear, doubt, and a desperate flickering hope. We were staking everything on a ghost of a theory, on the offhand remark of an engineer, on the hum of unseen forces in the air. We were fighting a war of physics, and the final examination was about to begin. Night fell over Longdendale. The night was cold and clear, the stars brilliant in a sky blessedly free of industrial haze. A deep stillness stretched for miles. I was with Morozova in a forward observation post, a small dugout carved into the ridge, smelling of damp soil and nervous sweat. Below us, the valley was a pool of darkness. The Martian column was due at any moment. A runner arrived, breathless. "They're in the valley's mouth, ma'am. Coming on slow." Morozova nodded, her face illuminated by the faint green glow of a wireless set. She picked up a field telephone. "Bell, are your crews clear?" Morgan Bell's voice crackled back from the dynamo station miles away. "Aye, Captain. Clear and ready to spin." "Begin," she said. The command was simple, almost anticlimactic. For a moment all was still. Then a low, deep hum emanated from the valley floor, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the teeth, in the bones. The hum was the sound of dynamos spinning up, of immense magnetic fields forming. The air crackled with static electricity. The fine hairs in my arms rose. The thunder line was active. Through our field glasses we saw them, a line of metallic giants entering the valley in a confident, inexorable procession. They moved with their usual smooth gait, their searchlights cutting swaths of white through the darkness. They were magnificent and terrible. The lead tripod reached the valley's heart, directly over the induction grid's densest part. And then it happened. The change was a tiny thing, a slight hesitation in its stride, a momentary awkwardness, as if it had landed on uneven ground where the ground was flat, a stumble, a fractional loss of coordination. The machine paused, its great head swiveling as if confused. It took another step, and this time the effect was more pronounced. The leg's movement was clumsy, a jerky motion that lacked its previous fluid perfection. It was fighting against an invisible current, a force that was sowing chaos in the heart of its nervous system. Morozova raised a flare gun. "Now," she whispered. She fired. The flare burst high enough above the valley, a searing white star that bathed the entire scene in a ghostly, instantaneous light, and the ridges erupted. The barrage was more a synchronized industrial demolition than a battle. The sound was a single concussive force that slammed into us, a weight we felt as much as heard. The shells converged on the target instead of peppering it. They tore into the lead tripod's legs, shredding the joint's complex machinery, buckling the supports. The giant, already unstable, was crippled. It swayed violently, its heat ray firing a wild, uncontrolled beam into the sky. For a long, silent moment it hung there, a monument to a dying empire. Afterward, with a groan of tortured metal that echoed down the valley, it toppled, crashing to the earth with a ground-shaking impact that sent tremors through our dugout. The unraveling was swift and absolute, the destruction of their lead machine threw the Martian column into disarray. The narrow valley trapped them, their primary advantage, mobility, nullified. Worse, the invisible field that permeated the air was poison to their technology. We watched through our glasses as they tried to maneuver, their movements becoming increasingly erratic and clumsy. They were like magnificent clockwork things with sand in their gears. A tripod would attempt to turn, only for one leg to lock up, causing it to lurch sideways. Its heat ray, intended as a weapon of surgical accuracy, swept wildly, burning great, useless scars into the hillside. The artillery was merciless. The gun crews, guided by Morozova's fire control plan, worked with the grim efficiency of factory hands on an assembly line. They ignored the machine's thrashing bodies and focused with single-minded purpose on the legs. A shell strike to a knee joint buckled a leg. Another severed a hydraulic line, making a foot drag uselessly. In the midst of the chaos, a Martian stumbled directly into the path of another. The two colossal machines collided with a shriek of scraping metal, their legs tangling in a fatal, clumsy embrace. They went down together, a mountain of ruined technology. Through my field glasses, I witnessed the most telling moment of all. I had my lens focused on the head of a struggling machine, one trying desperately to climb the steep valley wall to escape the electromagnetic field. An armor plate on its face had been peeled back by a shell blast, revealing the workings within. I could see the pilot, the Martian itself. A fleshy, tentacled creature, frantically manipulating its controls, and in its movements, in the panicked, uncoordinated lurching of its machine, I saw terror. It was a living being, trapped in a dying machine, realizing its doom was certain. The thought, then, came to me, unbidden, and with the force of a revelation. I was imagining the consciousness of that creature, the collective mind of the invaders, as they witnessed this astounding turn of events. They had defeated our finest soldiers with ease and burnt our greatest city. To them, the war was over. The planet was theirs, and then, from the defeated nation's heart, this new force had risen. A force that fought with chemistry instead of courage. One that laid traps of wire and steel instead of charging. A force that attacked the fundamental physics that allowed them to stand, rather than their bodies. I could almost hear the thought rippling through their collective consciousness, a wave of raw alien shock. We defeated their armies, we burnt their cities, the world was ours. And the final, terrible question, where did these ones come from? They had mistaken our soldiers for our strength, blind to the nation's true reinforcements, the quiet men who laid the tracks, who mined the coal, who understood the brutal, unforgiving language of iron. By morning, the battle was over. The Longdendale Valley was a tomb for giants. The Martian war effort in Britain was broken. We hunted down the few scattered and damaged machines in the weeks that followed. The invasion was over. Weeks later, I stood on the embankment in a scarred but recovering London. The air, for the first time in my memory, smelled of coal smoke and wet earth. The true victory had its own sound. The symphony of rivet guns on new bridges, the rumble of heavy wagons clearing debris, the groan of cranes lifting steel girders into place. This symphony was the sound of a nation getting back to work. My own war ended at a refugee camp in a converted school in Islington. After weeks of searching, of wading through the endless lists of dead and missing, I found her. My wife. She was thin, tired, but alive. The moment I saw her cross the crowded school hall, the Chronicle, the Martians, the Great War of Systems, it all fell away. There was only her. Our reunion was one of quiet tears, and the relief of holding a hand I thought I'd lost forever. One afternoon, I watched a crew laying new track near the Charing Cross Railway Bridge's ruins. Overseeing them, shouting orders and checking alignments with an expert eye was Morgan Bell. He wore the same greasy cap, his face still a mask of coal dust, but he moved with a new kind of authority. He was more than a foreman. He was an architect of our salvation. As workers bolted the final rail into place, a locomotive, pulling a long train of goods wagons, moved deliberately across the new section of track. As it passed, the driver blew the whistle. Its long, mournful yet triumphant sound echoing across the Thames was its own unique anthem. A simple, functional sound. The sound of meeting a schedule, of delivering goods, of a nation breathing again. I thought of Morozov's logic, of Bell's grounded expertise, of the anonymous chemists and engineers and railwaymen. I had begun this conflict as a man of letters, a believer in the power of abstract thought. I had ended it with a profound respect for the concrete, for the grimy, brilliant, and stubborn genius of ordinary people who, when faced with the end of their world, went to work and built a new one from the ashes. In that train whistle, I heard the true anthem of my species, and I felt a pride so deep and so fierce. It was almost painful. We were workers more than gods, and we had, against all odds, inherited the earth.